Okay, now that we have talked about value, identifying it, now that we have talked about different ways to measure it, both in terms of quantitative and qualitative, we're now going to talk about how to package that value, which is perhaps one of the hardest parts. So, how to translate those points of engagement into value statements. So, I've written it out as an equation, and then we'll go through an example of what that looks like. We did X action, so X being a part of the equation, and it provided Y value that Z numbers of our community to and insert a verb. So kind of like an equation Mad Libs, I guess. An example with actual specifics would be we live streamed as our action a talk on one of the items in our collection, and it provided a learning opportunity, the Y value, that 1,500, the Z value, of our community members have viewed and enjoyed. So it is one sentence doing a lot of heavy lifting because you're communicating what it is that you did. You are communicating what value was provided and pretty unequivocally. And then Z numbers. So the actual number of impact, because this activity does come with a number, of the result of that activity. So the activity, the value it gave, and how many people it gave that value to. So using this equation, as we start going through trying to translate the value it is that our collections and our work helps to provide, translating that to talk about it in terms of engagement, and then of course how that engagement is translating then into actual revenue dollars. So packaging options. Packaging obviously is something that goes around an object, whether for storage or shipping. As collection caretakers, we actually see and use a lot of packaging, but in this case, intellectual packaging is how we are going to package that message. So thinking about that one sentence and us wanting to communicate action, value, result. These are the different packaging mechanisms that we could use, and then we'll get into how to choose the most effective format for your message. So first, and perhaps most obvious one for us, is reports. We love reports. So whether it is a department annual report, whether it is a end of project report, what have you, reports are of course the first thing we think about when we think about trying to chronicle the work that we've done and why it matters. The next most frequently used, if not most obviously thought about, is the emails that we send. So whether it is an email to our boss or an email out to the rest of our institution, perhaps announcing an exciting new project, or you just got a new grant, our emails are frequent communication mechanisms that we can use and should use for communicating our value on a more regular basis. Another one to think about is infographics, especially for communicating to people who are not necessarily moved by words and they're more moved by visuals. Having infographics can be very helpful because it synthesizes your message into one page, and it is usually much more visual than a report. Again, as collection workers, we tend to be very detailed and very narrative heavy. And while that is wonderful in many regards, it is usually not as helpful or as effective when we are trying to communicate with people about what it is that we do and what its value is. Another thing to think about is presentations. So whether it's internal presentation, whether it's external, how can we use those presentations to frame the collections and the work that we do and what value it brings? Also, blog posts, articles, so informal, peer-reviewed, you run the gamut. But these are excellent non-report mechanisms where you can provide a bit more narrative or content around the simple equation of what it is that you do, what is the value of it, and what is the result. And then, of course, press releases, especially if you're part of any sort of larger organization, while it can be great to share fun news internally in your organization, I also encourage you to try and share as much good news as possible externally as well. It's not something we typically think about as collection workers, I've noticed, sort of behind the scenes, which has its own appeal, but it just means we don't think about press releases as much. All right, next thing to consider is who are you communicating with? Because depending on who it is, and we'll get into motivations in a minute, will change your answer or should change your answer on how it is that you are packaging your content. For example, you could potentially, within a year of work, need to communicate with your boss's boss, or the board, your peers within a department or in the field, your community, your granting agencies or donors, or your government. So depending on who it is that you answer to, who you liaise with, who's part of your ecosystem, considering who it is that you're communicating with internally versus externally, and then also starting to think about them as individuals and what their preferences and ability to understand what it is that you do and the value of that, while also considering what sort of package would be most effective. So when we're thinking about internally, our boss and our peers, it's usually a report or a presentation. But when we're thinking about our community, when we're thinking about communicating externally, it's not going to be a report and it's probably not a presentation. So what do those packages look like, or what should they look like in order to be appealing to that audience? So I want you to really consider not just who it is in a literal sense, but how they should be talked to and what sort of packaging would they want to spend time with.